Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackie Spear. I'm a congresswoman representing the 14th Congressional District in California, and I'm pleased that you are all here today to learn more about a very serious problem in academia and one that we think we have a solution for. Universities are supposed to be in the business of illumination, but as we've seen at UC Berkeley, where astronomer Jeff Marcy sexually harassed students for more than 10 years with no consequences, or at the University of Arizona, where Tim Slater held lab meetings at strip clubs and told one of his teaching assistants that she would teach a whole lot better if she didn't wear underwear, or at the University of Chicago, Jason Lieb, who sexually assaulted many students over a period of years in escalating behavior and at a number of different institutions. We're seeing the same pattern in academia that I've seen in my work against sexual assault in the military and sexual assault on college campuses. Typically, predators thrive in closed institutions where they can insinuate their own twisted code of conduct into the culture. Too often, these cases are handled in a grossly inappropriate fashion. Most of the time, allegations are simply swept under the proverbial rug. This allows sexual predators to reoffend over and over again. Some studies suggest as many as 6 or 7 times before they are finally caught and action is taken against them. In the case of faculty, they move between university in a scheme that some openly refer to as, quote, pass the harasser, unquote. For star faculty who can bring in millions of dollars in grant funding, they always seem to come out ahead, no matter how egregious their behavior is. Left in their wake is a trail of broken, damaged careers and lives. Survivors, often graduate students and postdocs, lose years of research, their funding, their confidence, and even sometimes their careers. I want to read from a letter sent to me from the individuals who experienced and witnessed Tim Slater's outrageous harassment. They say, quote, "We had our careers at best temporarily sidelined and at worst completely derailed. Several of us gave up access to research projects and publications we had initiated and developed. When the university initiated an investigation, several of us were put in a position of having to pay the costs of our own lawyers and other professionals to protect ourselves against accusations of libel. And finally, although the university found cause for our complaints, Slater had already been awarded tenure, and none of the victims of his abuse were notified of the findings of the investigation," unquote. We also have with us today 2 courageous survivors who have not gone in silence and whose careers have prospered, and you will be hearing from them in a short few moments. Federal funding agencies and universities need to stand up for these survivors and stop funding and hiring harassers. Let's be clear, we're talking about taxpayer money, and I don't want to see a dime of taxpayer money going to a grant awardee who has been a sexual harasser, pure and simple. That's why today I'm introducing the Federal Funding Accountability for Sexual Harassers Act, and the bill is quite simple. All it does is require universities to inform federal funding agencies about substantiated findings of sexual abuse, harassment, or discrimination. And this is how it works. If a university grievance procedure finds that a research professor has engaged in discrimination on the basis of sex, that includes sexual assault and harassment, the university must report the findings to all federal agencies that have awarded competitive research and development grants in the past 10 years to that institution. Each funding agency must then consider these reports when awarding future competitive research grants to that particular research professor. Now, I want to be clear that my bill does not require funding agencies to take any particular action other than to consider the information. I also want to make clear that funding agencies already assert oversight over the treatment of lab animals. Why should graduate students have fewer protections than mice? And I want to clarify that this problem is definitely not limited to science. For example, philosophy professor Thomas Pogge at Yale is also known to be a serial harasser. My bill would apply to any primary investigator or equivalent senior personnel who receives federal research and development funding, regardless of their field. Some will say that this bill is too burdensome for universities, and to them I say, if it's so burdensome, how many of these cases do you have each year? Some will also say this bill is too burdensome for funding agencies. To them I say, I have total faith that the same minds who landed a spacecraft on a moving comet or who are editing the human genome can find a way to track a few hundred names. You are fighting for your scientific future. Think big. Stephen Jay Gould, a famous evolutionary biologist, wrote, quote, "We pass through this world but once. Few tragedies can be more extensive than the stunting of life. Few injustices deeper than denial of an opportunity to strive or even to hope by a limit imposed from without, but falsely identified as lying within." That's the motivation for this legislation. Women are being driven from science by sexual assault and harassment. They're being blamed for it. No one should be denied their chance to reach for the stars because someone else reached for their bodies. I'm proud to say that this is a measure that already has 6 co-sponsors and the support from the American Association of University Women, the American Federation of Teachers, the National Organization of Women, and the Association of Women in Mathematics. Now I get the treat of introducing you to some remarkable women. And they will make the case certainly better than I, but make the case in such a profound way that it really demands that we take action. Dr. Kate Clancy is a professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois. In 2014, she and her collaborators published the first survey of sexual harassment and assault occurrences in scientific field sites.
Thank you, Representative Spear, for the opportunity to speak today. The Federal Funding Accountability for Sexual Harassers Act is a bill I can't help but take personally. Years ago, as a graduate student, I heard tales from my peers about the horrible experiences they had while trying to conduct research in the sciences. Bullying, intimidation, casual cruelty. But as grad students, we'd become accustomed to this as normal. It didn't occur to me to say or do much of anything, even though most of my friends with these experiences were people of color or white women. Time passed, and I graduated without major incident, and eventually I got a tenure-track professor job. It wasn't until I got on the other side of things that I realized how exploitative the system was. And it wasn't until some of my friends started telling me of the harassment, assault, and rape they experienced, particularly when conducting field research, that I thought to do anything about it. Eventually, I worked with a collaborative team, Robin Nelson of Santa Clara University, Julian Rutherford of University of Illinois Chicago, and Katie Hind of Arizona State University, to develop the Survey of Academic Field Experiences, or the SAFE study. At the time, all 4 of us were untenured, which, if you don't know how academia works, means we were in a probationary period with limited job security. Many people told us that what we were doing was risky, potentially career-killing, to conduct research just to see to what extent sexual harassment and assault even occurs at field sites. Well, we published our survey of over 600 scientists in 2014. In our sample, 71% of women and 41% of men reported experiencing sexual harassment. 26% of women and 6% of men in our sample reported experiencing sexual assault, including rape. 2 other findings were especially important to us. First, female trainees were the most frequent targets of both harassment and assault. And second, when women were harassed or assaulted, the perpetrator was more likely to be someone above them in the workplace hierarchy at their field site, a boss, a director, the lead investigator of a project. Research shows that these kind of vertical abuses have a severe impact on job satisfaction and mental health. Most devastating to me were the conversations that happened after the study came out. Nearly every story told to me was a story of someone starting out delighted, curious, leaping out of their skin in their excitement to study rocks or dig up fossils or tag birds or collect water samples. They went into science to make the world a better place, not find a date, and certainly not to be harassed or assaulted. And then that excitement for science and discovery was dampened, sometimes permanently, by their experiences. I don't want taxpayer money going toward abusive bosses, and I don't want to lose another brilliant mind from science. I don't want findings of Title IX investigations to get shelved when a professor jumps to a new university. I don't want people of color and white women feeling unsafe in their jobs. And that's why I support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Clancy. Now we're going to hear from Ann Hedgepeth. She is representing the American Association of University Women who have endorsed this bill.
Good afternoon. My name is Ann Hedgepeth, and I'm with the American Association of University Women. AUW thanks Representative Spear for her leadership and work to end sexual harassment and violence, and we are proud to stand here today in support of the Federal Funding Accountability for Sexual Harassers Act. I also want to thank Kate, Sarah, and Meredith for speaking out today. These stories of sexual harassment and violence that our students, scientists, and professors face are tough to hear, but I'm inspired by their courage in coming forward and their leadership in lending voices to solutions. We've seen the impact of these types of stories over recent years with regards to peer-on-peer sexual violence on college campuses, and it has served as a bit of a wake-up call. I only hope it can do the same with regards to the issues we're discussing here today. AUW is the nation's leading voice promoting equity and education for women and girls. Since our founding in 1881, we've brought people together with the common goal of breaking through educational and economic barriers for women and girls. We frequently publish research that takes on critical issues, and recently our reports, Why So Few Women in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics, and Solving the Equation, the Variables for Women's Success in Engineering and Computing, have illuminated the fact that while we've seen progress for women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM fields, inequities remain. For many women in STEM, their workplaces and classrooms continue to contain sexism and discrimination, limiting their careers. As Dr. Clancy's research shows, sex discrimination is happening, and it's happening at alarming rates. And when harassers can move from school to school with no record of their behavior, the problem continues. These and other instances of sex discrimination affect the ability of everyone, women and men, to get the most out of their education, training, and research. And we know that there is a real fear for survivors who come forward that no one will believe them, no one will act on their claims, and that they will suffer academically and professionally. Every year, multiple federal agencies spend billions of dollars funding STEM research. This is an area in which research shows women continue to be underrepresented. Federal science agencies are supposed to ensure that academic institutions to which they offer grants comply with Title IX, the federal law that bans sex discrimination in education and research. But unfortunately, these agencies have an uneven track record in monitoring compliance. In December 2015, the GAO published a report examining Title IX compliance around federal grant making. The overall finding was that agencies are not taking an active role in ensuring recipients of their funding are abiding by Title IX. Many agencies expressed a need for additional clarity about their role, and some agencies identified that since they had not heard of sex discrimination at the colleges and universities they fund, the agencies had not proactively looked for Title IX compliance. The Federal Funding Accountability for Sexual Harassers Act would help fix these gaps. By ensuring that federal grant-making agencies know of substantiated findings of sexual harassment at institutions of higher education, there can no longer be confusion as to its occurrence. These agencies would then have the clear authority to consider this information when making future funding decisions. This transparency will help ensure that taxpayer funds are not being distributed to sexual harassers, and that all STEM professionals can work in equitable environments. AUW encourages representatives to co-sponsor the federal funding Accountability for Sexual Harassers Act. We hope federal agencies will take action to implement its approach, and we encourage Congress to move the bill forward.
Next, we will hear from Dr. Sarah Ballard, who is an astronomer and has bravely spoken out about the harassment she endured as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. She will tell you Jeff Marcy didn't succeed in pushing her out of the field of astronomy. Dr. Ballard.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'd like to use my handful of minutes to give a sense not only for what happened to me while I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, but also why I chose to stay in astronomy and something of a vision I have for a scientific culture in which all individuals can thrive. I'm 32 years old today. I was 20 in 2005 when I was a newly declared astrophysics major at UC Berkeley. I didn't start knowing that I wanted to study the stars. This is something I had to discover about myself in a freshman class in astronomy. I had a moment in that class upon seeing a particular image of outer space in which I realized, as much as any human being ever can, something of the majesty and scale of our universe. UC Berkeley equipped me with scientific training that was excellent, and I call upon it every day in my work. And yet, my experience there as a student was not uniformly good. I also experienced sexual harassment from a professor of mine in a pattern that started with encouraging words and escalated to sexual conversations and physical contact. Let me tell you what that was like for me. To have an established astronomer tell you that you are full of promise, that you're not only passionate about physics but good at it, I started to nourish a hope, and to wonder whether then to forfeit that hope after understanding that his motives were not what I imagined they were was very painful. My best friend and I, another astrophysics major, worried together about the direction things were taking with this professor. I knew that confronting him might affect whether he would write me a letter of recommendation for internships or eventually for graduate school, and I told her, if things go badly, please still ask him for a letter for yourself, because we both knew that letter from a highly esteemed and established scientist makes the difference between the internship, the graduate admissions letter that eventually means you get a crack at being a real scientist. That's how it is on the ground. As a young woman scientist, you're full of hope for yourself and others, but there's a bitter taste, because you see how few women senior faculty there are, and you say to yourself, even if I don't make it, the woman next to me might. And yet, I never had that conversation with him. He suddenly cooled toward me, a circumstance that seemed honestly magical to me at the time. I know now it was because he was confronted independently by a woman graduate student about his harassment of another undergraduate altogether, but I only learned that later. For years, I thought I was the only young student he treated the way he did, and he wrote me a letter of recommendation. My hard work and my flawless grades earned me admission to Harvard's PhD program in astronomy and astrophysics. While I was there, I published results about as yet undiscovered exoplanets using techniques that had never been used before to identify worlds around other stars. And I learned at a professional conference that this professor had harassed other young women, that he had a reputation for doing so in our field that went back 20 years, that was documented at 2 universities. It was 3 years later that myself and 3 other women provided testimony for a Title IX investigation of this professor. At this point, I had earned my PhD and started my NASA Carl Sagan Fellowship at the University of Washington. The UC found that he had violated their sexual harassment policy, but only instructed him not to do so again, or he might face consequences for his behavior, including suspension. It was only when the media, and specifically BuzzFeed News, published the outcome of the investigation that he resigned after 24 members of the astronomy faculty signed an effective vote of no confidence. A few months later, Berkeley shared documentation for 19 other Title IX investigations, and those reports showed that while some staff members lost their job, not a single faculty member was fired for harassment. I remember very well how powerless and afraid I felt when I was 21. I desperately needed someone with more power than I to make it stop, to use his or her knowledge and experience about the serial nature of harassment to protect me. I couldn't protect myself then, but I can be the woman now that I needed so badly 11 years ago. This is why Congresswoman Spear's bill, the Federal Funding Accountability for Sexual Harassers Act, gives me a new measure of hope. The likeliest outcome, if we all do nothing, is that another generation of young women astronomers, largely funded by taxpayer dollars, will be forced to perform the same stale emotional calculus. I love this science and I am so good at it, but is it worth the misery? I feel such optimism, imagining that because of this bill, universities will suddenly find it worth their while to remove serial harassers' access to students, and I can look forward to finding planets with girls who today are only 10, who have yet to discover their love of astronomy as I did. Though I'm in front of you today, I'm not proportionally speaking the typical face of harassment. Women of color experience harassment more frequently than white women and with less just outcomes. I'm committed to building a new scientific culture that doesn't just work for some women, it has to work for all women, and indeed all people. This means thinking carefully not only how I have been wronged, my full humanity not seen, but also how I myself am a participant in that culture of harm, which is decidedly unscientific. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ballard. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Meredith Reichs. She's an anthropology professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, who overcame severe harassment to become successful in her field.
Thank you, Representative Spear. So I'm Meredith Reichs. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I am so fortunate and so grateful to work at such a vibrant public institution. There was a time, however, when I almost gave up the dream of going to graduate school, completing and becoming a researcher and a college professor. And the story I'm about to tell you is why that happened. As a graduate student, I had the privilege of working at several field sites, including one in a rural part of Africa. A senior researcher on my project there spoke to and touched me in unwelcome and inappropriate ways. This startled and upset me, and I spent weeks scrutinizing my own behavior, wondering what I had done to invite the unwelcome contact. I came up with two possibilities. Either this senior researcher had done something wrong, or I was the human equivalent of Winnie the Pooh's donkey friend Eeyore, and I caused bad things to happen just by existing. When I worked up the courage to report the incident to leadership at the field site, the senior researchers closed ranks. What I described, they said, had not actually happened. In fact, it was my fantasy. Suddenly, I faced not only my colleagues' disbelief about what had happened, but also the terrifying possibility that they, the people whose support I needed to complete the degree, to finish the work, would no longer trust either my character or my science. If they thought that I had made up an accusation of sexual misconduct, what else about me would they start to doubt? In an attempt to restore order at the field site in the following months, senior researchers and administrators came up with a variety of stories about what had happened. They said that I was either a lesbian or had already been sleeping with the senior researcher. They called me intimidating and too self-effacing by turns. They took me to task for telling anyone and ordered me not to discuss it further. I requested two things. I requested that they acknowledge that something had happened and that some remedial action be taken with the person who had approached me so inappropriately. But instead, they told me to apologize to the senior researcher for the distress that I had caused him by my unfounded accusations. I apologized. He did not accept the apology and withdrew from the project, leaving a gap where his expertise had been. As Dr. Ballard said, when you are an early career researcher, the people with whom you do your graduate work are your gateway to professional success and even just professional viability. They write letters of recommendation for jobs and grants. They comment on your manuscripts, nominate you to serve on panels and contribute to edited volumes, and they vouch for you in the wider scientific world. An incident of the kind that I experienced fractures those relationships with repercussions that can be felt, that I have felt, for a long time afterward. Speaking for myself, the experience of being harmed and disbelieved about the harm led deep into self-doubt. I came away with the gut conviction that I was a bad person who caused disasters just by existing. I had nightmares and flashbacks. I felt fear towards others and loathing towards myself. If I could have had my way at the end of graduate school, I would have spent most days with the covers over my head. When the symptoms did not go away after several months, and when it became clear that they were interfering with my ability to finish, a wise counselor suggested a therapy designed for survivors of trauma, which I had not identified with before. I was fortunate to have my graduate advisor's support in petitioning to get insurance to cover a part of that therapy. And I was even more fortunate that the treatment was successful and that I was able to wake up every day being grateful not to be experiencing trauma. With care from friends and family, I crossed the finish line. I've done work that I believe makes a contribution to my field, and I relish the opportunity to do more. I am nervous to be standing in front of you today because speaking about experiences like mine still carries professional risk. That I am standing here is a vote of confidence. I believe that Representative Spear's Federal Funding Accountability for Sexual Harassers Act will make visible a phenomenon that is, as you heard from Professor Clancy, widespread and often invisible. Let's vote to bring these stories out of the dark. Let's allocate our nation's precious research dollars to investigators who train the next generation of researchers with the basic respect that they and that we all deserve.
I think you can tell, having heard these remarkable women, how extraordinary they are and how easy it would have been for them to close their books and walk off those campuses and do something else. And that would be a great loss to this country. So thank you again all so much for just extraordinary testimony. All right, questions? Well, you said it all. Thank you all, yes.
Joanne Carney with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Separate from the legislation, from a scientific society perspective, but also from an institutional perspective, what are other mechanisms, separate from the legislation, that we should be considering to separate the role that your mentors play in signing the letters and signing off or nominating you for a fellowship? Or if there are things to kind of separate that power play that we should be thinking about?
I have a couple thoughts.
Take the microphone.
Yeah. And I'm sure my colleagues here also have some important points to add, but should I turn this on or just hit the button? Okay. So one of the things is actually separating funding lines for graduate students and their faculty. So often we end up putting our grad students on our grants and funding them that way, but in the humanities and a lot of the social sciences, we actually keep those things separate. And I think that would help. Some of the other things is that professional societies need to actually have stronger codes of conduct and codes of ethics. Professional societies should be supporting this bill. And I think they also can be creating their own grievance procedures. There's a lot of research now and a lot of legal scholars who are saying that we need to come up with scenarios that are outside of the legal mechanism, because different types of reporting procedures might help different types of survivors. So this bill is an incredibly important piece of the project. I feel like it's one of the most important things because it's getting the story out there, and I think what Representative Spear is doing is incredibly important. I hope it's the first step of many to actually get professional societies to start looking at some of their members, especially the ones that they know are serial harassers, and yet they have medals and awards and all sorts of really notable, amazing things associated with a professional society, when what they should be doing is censuring them.
I'd also love to add that while this bill takes an important step, it creates a mechanism where the information we need is reported to agencies and they can use it. Agencies currently have the ability to conduct, an authority to conduct Title IX compliance reviews at the institutions that they give money to. What we've seen is the agencies that conduct those reviews can have a conversation that comes with best practices and recommendations for those institutions to really combat the hostile climates that we're seeing occurring at schools. That can involve individual action with harassers. It can also be about changing other aspects of the particular departments or structures that exist at those schools. More of those could make a big difference in seeing change at these schools, and that's something that could be happening now. But since we heard from agencies that they aren't sure this is going on, Representative Spear's bill would help provide the information maybe that they need to take the action that could lead, I think, to real change in these institutions.
I wanted to speak to the part of the process that occurs before universities have that Title IX funding in hand, which is you need individual students to come forward, and that cost is high emotionally and mentally. So if that's the case, one of the solutions that I've seen put forward otherwise for sexual assault is anonymous reporting using an escrow system. Callisto is an example of this. And so with a mechanism like this, you could have a perceived very low cost of recording what has happened to you, the individual who perpetrated a behavior against you, without having to confront that individual, particularly if your funding is contingent upon that person. So, and then that system would then recognize when it has received a critical mass of testimony about the same individual. At that point, you might have an incentive for individual women to provide Title IX testimony, knowing that they're not alone, and sort of lowering the social cost of that. That's one solution I've heard put forward for getting individuals who've suffered sexual harassment to the Title IX stage, which often appears intractable to many young students, or indeed perhaps they don't know about it at all.
And at an almost even lower level, ensuring that students have multiple mentors, because in graduate school you are incredibly vulnerable to and dependent upon your principal advisor. And when people have multiple advisors to consult with, then there are multiple outlets for discussing things that are perhaps not going well in a particular relationship. And I think something that our professional organizations can do is incentivize high integrity mentoring in a way that it's often not acknowledged in our field. And I believe that this is something that disproportionately affects people of color and white women who carry a tremendous amount of the affective and logistical burden of mentoring. So if that could be an acknowledged part of people's professional lives, perhaps that would create a wider network within which people could come forward.
Any other questions? All right, thank you all for being here.